Tonight, we drift into a land where moonlight once mingled with ink, and ancient cities whispered equations to the stars. Welcome to Al-Andalus, medieval Islamic Spain, where marble libraries stood taller than castles, and knowledge was not just prized, it was sacred. As you settle in and let the calm wrap around you, remember this. In this story, silence is a telescope, and time is a scroll waiting to be unrolled. We begin in the 10th century. In the gleaming city of Cordoba, a jewel set in the crown of the Caliphate. By day, its streets hummed with scholars, poets, and merchants from every corner of the known world. By night, candles flickered behind latticework windows where astronomers leaned over parchment, eyes heavy, hearts full, charting the heavens above. But this isn't the Cordoba of tourist brochures or fairy tales. This is the Cordoba where a boy named Sammy, born to a humble parchment maker, discovered a strange parchment left behind by a wandering scholar. It had no name, no seal, no beginning, just a diagram, a spiral, a mathematical spiral that twisted out from a single point like the tail of a galaxy. His father thought it was a mistake, a misprint, something to be recycled into the lining of a book. But Sami didn't see waste. He saw a question, a mystery folded inside ink. So he tucked it beneath his robe, far from his father's eyes and even farther from those who might understand it too well. You see, knowledge in Cordoba was powerful, sometimes too powerful. The libraries held thousands of texts from Greece, Persia, India, and beyond. There were treatises on surgery, maps of lands no one dared visit, and commentaries on the stars that hinted at truths even scholars feared to read aloud. The spiral, it didn't belong to any known constellation, and yet it mirrored the motion of planets. It echoed the whirls in nautilus shells and storm clouds. It was natural, but alien. Sami couldn't forget it. At night, while his father snored, he unrolled the parchment and stared, candlelight dancing on the curves. By day, he practiced his letters with sharp discipline, so the teacher at the local madrasa would not suspect where his true curiosity lead him, until one afternoon, a stranger appeared at the marketplace, wrapped in wool and silence, carrying nothing but a wooden astrolabe and a single question: who among you has seen the spiral? He didn't shout it, he whispered, but in Cordoba even whispers had weight. Sami froze. The stranger's eyes scanned the crowd like a scholar scanning text. There was nothing urgent about him, nothing alarming, but his voice stirred something. Ancient, not fear, but memory, as if the question had been asked long ago and forgotten. Sami walked away. Quickly, he didn't run. That would attract attention, but his heart thudded like a drum against his ribs. That night, the spiral seemed to glow faintly beneath the parchment's surface. It wasn't ink, not anymore. It was something else, something alive. But this isn't a story about magic. This is a story about history. And history, when told slowly, carefully, with breath and silence, has a magic of its own. The spiral, it would turn out to be real, but not in the way Sami expected. In Cordoba's Grand Library, the Beit al-Hikmah, knowledge was not only stored, it was tested, copied, debated, hidden. Among its caretakers was an old scholar named Olmari, who walked with a limp and a lantern, and spoke in riddles unless you asked the right question. He found Sami one evening, crouched near the fountain, watching the stars reflect in the water's ripple. Without asking, he sat beside the boy and said, "You found it, didn't you? The pattern." Sami said nothing. Olmari continued, "There are maps in the sky that do not belong to any empire. He reached into his satchel and drew out a star chart. Not just any star chart. This one showed stars with no names, nebulas drawn in smudged ink. And near the edge, that same spiral. You know what it is? Sami asked finally. Almari shook his head. Only what it might be. A theory, a danger, a message. Then he leaned close and whispered, "It only appears every 863 years." Sami's breath caught. "And it's appearing now." The scholar nodded. "Which means we are being watched, not by men, not by kings, but by history itself." What could that mean? He didn't say. Instead, he handed Sami the chart and walked into the shadow of the library's western wall, where whispers went to sleep and books never returned. The next morning, he was gone. No one remembered him arriving. No one remembered him leaving, not even the other librarians. Sami kept the chart, he kept the spiral, and he kept his silence. Over the next few months, Cordoba changed. Not suddenly, not loudly, but subtly. There were more strangers in the libraries. Quiet ones, with gloves and no names. Books began to vanish from their shelves. Only a few at first. Ancient ones, star charts, philosophy texts, scrolls on ancient calendars and orbits. The librarians claimed they were being preserved, but Sami noticed they never came back, and the stars above, they didn't change, but they didn't need to. The spiral was never up there, it was down here, in the way certain events seemed to repeat, in how whispers returned, in how secrets once found returned, stronger, louder, harder to burn. So, what was the spiral? A message, from whom? That no one knew. Not yet, but there's something calming in this chaos. Something grounding in watching history unfold, not in battles or kings, but in the quiet rooms where ink meets curiosity. Sami wasn't a hero. He was a boy with questions. And sometimes, that's the most dangerous kind of person to be. The spiral wouldn't vanish. Not now. Not for another 863 years. And by then, it would find someone else. But tonight, as you drift deeper into calm, remember this. Sometimes, the stars don't guide us. They record us. Not in stories, but in spirals. And someone, somewhere, is reading. The courtyard of the observatory no longer echoed with the confident steps of scholars, but with the cautious tread of silence. Tiles that had once mirrored moonlight now bore fine dust, and the intricately carved pillars stood as relics, not just of architecture but of thought itself. The night air held its breath, as though waiting for some echo of the past to stir awake once more. Yet, beneath the hushed hush of fading stars, the legacy of Alzar-Kali and his brethren still hummed like a hidden chord in a forgotten song. In the great stone alcove, where once instruments of celestial precision stood proudly astrolabes, finely tuned they could read the heartbeat of Jupiter's transit, there remained a single brass armillary sphere. It leaned slightly, one axis warped by time, yet its rings still sang softly when the wind whispered through. Each circle had been etched by hand, years of careful work engraved by fingers that had memorized the stars better than their own names. This was no ordinary relicate, was a memory engine, a model of the universe created by men who saw time not in hours, but in orbits. Jamal, the last custodian of the observatory's library, was a boy of 14 when he first brushed his fingers along those brass circles. Now, decades later, he stood before the same sphere, candle in hand, the flickering flame painting golden movement onto the bronze rings. He could not bring himself to light the lanterns any more. The brighter the flame, the starker the shadows. It cast, and Andalusia had too many shadows already. He still recalled the days when the observatory felt alive, not with noise, but with intention. You could hear it in the quiet murmurs as scholars debated latitude measurements, in the gentle clicks of quills against parchment, in the patient grinding of minerals into inks of celestial blue and smoky grey. Maps had been drawn here with the steadiness of monks and the daring of poets. The stars were not merely dots on black parchment, they were coordinates on the soul's journey, and they had not only watched the heavens, they had touched time. In the rooms beyond the courtyard, old manuscripts spoke of mechanical calendars so intricate they could predict lunar eclipses a century in advance. There had been wheels inside wheels, dials within dials, built not just to measure time but to understand it. Jamal still remembered one machine, carved from cedar and brass, that sang a low, humming note when turned like the sky sighing through gears. But Andalusia, once the lantern of knowledge, had dimmed, not all at once, but like twilight slipping beneath a cloud. The wars came quiet at first, then shrieking. Armies thundered down from the north, and scholars began vanishing like stars before dawn. Libraries were not burned. No, they were repurposed. What was once a house of learning became an archive of silence. Pages once turned by ink-stained fingers now lay untouched, waiting for readers who would never come. Still, Jamal had remained, not out of hope, but duty. It had been his father's wish, and his grandfather's before him, that someone remember, that someone tend the texts, clean the mirrors, keep the keys, not for glory, for continuity. He often said the stars did not need us, but we needed them. And in a world now governed by shifting crowns and whispered decrees, it was the quiet math of the cosmos that gave him peace in the lowest chamber. Beneath stone arch and aging mortar rested the star maps, hundreds of them, some drawn on deerskin, others inked onto papyrus imported from the Nile. They were curled tight, like secrets sealed in cedar cases bound with brass clasps. No one opened them anymore except Jamal. He would sit once a week and unfurl one at random. He would trace the orbits, follow the trails of Venus and Saturn, read the notations left in the margins. Some were technical, others deeply human, observed from Cordoba in the year of dust. Sky was clear. Wife gave birth the same evening. Mars delayed its rise by 10 breaths. Father died that night. The stars were not just data, they were diary. They bore witness not only to the universe's rhythm, but to the personal cadence of those who watched it. It was this that Jamal feared the world had forgotten, that knowledge was not cold. It was warm, lived, deeply felt. Once, a boy from the city, curious, sharp-eyed, apprentice, had come asking questions. He spoke of philosophy and motion, quoted Ptolemy and Aristotle with impressive ease. Jamal had let him browse the outer library. The boy's eyes widened as he discovered names rarely spoken aloud anymore. Al-Battani, Al-Tusi, Ibn Shatta. He stayed for days, reading by lantern, skipping meals, and then he vanished, taken by someone or something that did not favor old truths. Jamal had said nothing when the guards came. He merely bowed, offered dates and tea, and let them search. They found nothing, for Jamal had already hidden the most important manuscripts beneath the flooring. Beneath centuries of dust and cobwebs, the observatory looked old. They assumed it had been empty for decades. They left without burning it down. That was victory enough. Now, in his later years, Jamal's beard was silver, his eyes dim, but his mind still moved with the stars. He knew when the moon would rise red, and which season brought meteors. He still recalibrated the old sundial. At equinox, still hummed the same tuning chant his grandfather had used when aligning the armillary sphere. Outside, the world no longer asked the stars for answers. It asked court officials and generals and traders with gold-tipped scrolls. The night sky had become decoration, not guide. But within the observatory, time still obeyed the constellations. Jamal lit incense, a habit more spiritual than scholarlian, walked the narrow stone hallway leading to the original tower dome. The ceiling had long since crumbled, but the platform remained. He climbed the steps, each worn smooth by centuries of sandaled feet. At the top, he looked skyward, dot above him. Orion stood bold and clear, his belt a silver ladder in the sky. To the west, Taurus yawned across the horizon, and Venus blinked low near the edge of the rooftops. Jamal whispered their names, like greeting old friends. He took out his grandfather's journal, the one bound in worn green leather, and began sketching once more. Each night he added one more line to the starscape, not to correct it, but to remember it. His hand shook, but the ink lines held. This was not cartography, was reverence. And though the city no longer climbed the hill, to ask about solstices, eclipses, or planetary retrogrades, Jamal continued, not out of faith that the world would remember, but out of certainty that the stars never forgot in the deepest drawer of the library. Sealed by a mechanism so old even Jamal had to coax it open with song, lay one last divisor, spherical astrolabe, ancient beyond telling. Unlike the others, this one bore inscriptions in 3 languages, Arabic, Latin, and a third he never could quite name. It was said to be the final gift of Al-Zarqali himself, built not for measurement, but for prophecy. Jamal had never used it, but tonight something tugged at his thoughts. A whisper carried on the wind, a shift in the sky's pattern, subtle, but undeniable. A red star blinking where none should be. He unlocked the drawer. The astrolabe was cold and heavier than he remembered. He turned it slowly, and the gears moved with impossible smoothness, and then it clicked. The rings aligned in a pattern he had never seen. Symbols, long dormant, glowed faintly in the candlelight. Jamal inhaled sharply, not in fear but in awe. Some knowledge had not been lost. It had merely been waiting. The astrolabe glowed faintly under candlelight, though no flame should have caused such illumination. It was a dull, soft warmth, like moonlight made liquid. Jamal did not speak. In the silence, he could hear the gentle clicking of the gears inside, each one moving not just in metal, but in memory. The sphere's alignment had shifted into a shape unfamiliar to him, an arc crossing. Constellations that had never been plotted on any known map. He set it gently on the ancient cedar desk and leaned close. There, among the etchings of Arabic and Latin, was a third script, neither flowing like Persian nor clipped like Greek. It curved, coiled, spiraled. It was older. He traced it with a fingertip, not understanding the meaning but sensing the purpose. The symbols weren't meant to be read. They were meant to be remembered. That night, Jamal did not sleep. He brought down a dozen manuscripts from the upper shelves, each one older than the city's most ancient mosque, their spines crumbling with the weight of centuries. These were not star maps or mechanical blueprints. These were the personal journals of the early astronomers, the ones who had founded the observatory when Cordoba still hummed with science and the caliphate stretched. its golden shadow across the Iberian Peninsula. One journal in particular bore the name Ishaq ibn Marwan, a scholar often dismissed in later records as eccentric. He had written not about stars, but about patterns, cycles of fire and cold, the silence between planetary alignments, and strange dreams that came only during eclipses. Jamal turned to a page near the center, where the ink had faded into sepia whispers. There, surrounded by drawings of overlapping moons, was a phrase in Arabic. When the stars curved backward and the red light stands still, the archive will awaken. It made no sense. Or at least, it hadn't until tonight. He looked again at the astrolabe, its ringed patterns frozen in new geometry. The red star, the shift in Venus, the way Taurus seemed to linger too long on the western edge. The stars were curving slowly, yes, but with purpose. It wasn't astronomy anymore. It was a message. He moved with careful urgency, descending the spiral steps to the deepest vault. Here, the stone grew colder, and the silence pressed thicker against the ear. Few had entered this room since the time of Ishaq himself. Jamal lit the iron sconces along the curved wall, and shadows began to dance. He passed shelves of star charts, scrolls wrapped in velvet, a rusted quadrant, and finally reached the oldest door in the observatorious circular hatch carved into basalt, embedded with gemstones that had long lost their gleam. It bore no lock, no handle, only a depression at its center, shaped like a circular circle, the exact size of the base of the astrolabe. He hesitated. No one had told him this door existed. He had discovered it decades ago, but left it untouched. His grandfather had warned him not to go seeking truths that were hidden for good reason. Some things, he'd whispered once, are not meant to be understood, only guarded, but the stars had spoken, and their silence had become a whisper. Jamal placed the astrolabe into the depression. It clicked, the door hissed, and then, slowly, it turned. The chamber beyond was not a vault. It was a dome, massive, hollow, stone walls covered in carved constellations that shimmered with trapped starlight. The air smelled not of dust, but of ozone and lavender. And at the center, resting on a pedestal of black marble, was a second device, larger than the astrolabe, a sphere within a sphere, suspended above the pedestal by unseen force. Its rings turned not in bronze, but in glass and light. Jamal stepped closer. He did not recognize this machine. No drawing of it existed in the archives, no mention of its construction in the engineer journals. It was not human work, yet it was waiting for him. Inscribed into the base was a name, not a person, a project, a myth. The Archive of Orbits. He had read of it only once in a margin scribble inside a damaged journal attributed to Al-Zakali. A theory, a vision, a mechanism that would not only record the sky, but listen to it, detect patterns in starlight, in planetary alignment, in solar echoes. Not a calendar. A communicator. Jamal reached out. The instant his fingers brushed the rim, the inner sphere flared with a sudden pulse of pale blue light. The chamber came alive. Constellations on the wall began to shift, move, flow, as if charting a sky no longer above Cordoba, but perhaps above some distant past or distant future. He could see strange patterns drawn across unfamiliar stars. He saw a line connecting Sirius to a dark companion no telescope had ever captured. He saw a set of 3 red stars pulsing in rhythm, forming a triangle that moved slightly each second, as if breathing, a voice note. Not a voice, but an impression pressed gently against his thoughts. Not words, but shape, meaning, direction. Look beyond time. Observe not the orbit, but the memory of the orbit. Not where the stars are, but where. They remember having been. Jamal fell to his knees. Not in fear. In reverence, the stars had a memory. And this machine, this archive, was built to read it. He saw flashes now. Scenes, not hallucinations, not dreams. Impressions stored in light. A room much like this one, with different walls, different instruments. Men in robes of deep blue. A woman with silver earrings, adjusting a lens taller than herself. Children etching constellations into stone. An old man crying as he watched a red comet vanish over the curve of the world dot. Then darkness, then silence. The stars shifted again. Jamal opened his eyes, breath trembling. The archive of orbits had shown him more than data. It had shown him lineage, not of people, but of ideas. A legacy that stretched across centuries, not through blood, but through observation. This was not just astronomy. It was remembrance. And someone had built a machine to preserve it, to hold the sky's memory the way ink holds a poem. He had to document it. He ran back to the upper chamber, hands shaking, and pulled out a new scroll. He began to write not in narrative, but in patterns. He copied the alignments, drew the triangle of red stars, labeled the rhythmic shift of Orion's belt. He wrote equations he barely understood, but felt were correct. And in the margins, like Ishak, he added his own note, observed. Beneath Cordoba, in the year of silence, stars remember what men forget. The night passed unnoticed, when dawn crept across the eastern hills, and sunlight broke through the cracked roof of the observatory. It did not find a crumbling relic. It found a man hunched over new charts, candle stubs flickering at his side. The air still humming faintly with the memory of constellations no longer visible. Jamal had not slept. He had not needed to. The stars had spoken, and he had listened. And somewhere, far beyond Andalusia, in places where no feet had ever walked, the sky's memory shifted. The archive had awakened. The sun had risen, but its light did not penetrate the deeper rooms of the observatory. Morning in Cordoba had begun, merchants rolling their carts onto cobbled streets, muezzins calling from distant minarets, and the scent of baked bread curling through the air like a memory, but none of it reached Jamal. He sat unmoving, his fingers stained with ink, his eyes fixed on the scrolls he had marked during the night. The room was quiet except for the occasional creak of old wood and the faint, almost imperceptible ticking of the astrolabe that no longer behaved like a mere machine. The archive had given him a glimpse, but a glimpse was not knowledge. A glimpse was only an invitation. He stood slowly, back aching from the hours spent bent over ancient tables, and turned toward the lower vault once more. He had not closed the door the night before. It still stood ajar, its circular frame now cool to the touch. The astrolabe nestled within its central slot as though it had always belonged there. Jamal stepped through it again, this time with less awe and more purpose. The chamber was just as he had left it, silent, immense, alive in its own quiet rhythm. The archive of orbits floated still in the center, slowly rotating, its inner rings shimmering with faint pulses of bluish light. The constellations carved into the dome glowed dimly, shifting ever so slightly. He approached, not to touch, but to watch, to listen. This time, it did not flare or pulse. Instead, it began to hum, a soft, low tone, Not like music, not like machinery. It was closer to a chant. A sound not meant for ears, but for memory. The sort of sound you forget you heard until something, a week later, reminds you in the pit of your stomach. Jamal closed his eyes and let the sound pass through him, and as he did, shapes formed behind his eyelids. He saw the sky, not as it was now, but as it had been hundreds of years ago before telescopes, before towers, before even the great library of Baghdad had lit its first candle. The stars were sharper, denser, the air thinner, as though the earth herself had not yet learned to breathe heavily. Beneath that sky stood people, but not in robes and turbans, in cloaks made of woven reeds, tattoos curling across their faces, eyes like polished obsidian. They studied the heavens without maps, without ink, only memory. Then the vision shifted. A high plateau under a red sun. Crystalline tools carved into lines across sand, marking solstices not yet named. Voices speaking in harmony, calling out patterns as though singing stars into alignment. A circle of stones arranged not by superstition, but by calculation. And then, silence again. Jamal opened his eyes and staggered back. His heart beat fast, not in fear, but in recognition. These were not his ancestors. They were not even from his continent. And yet they watched the same sky. They had drawn the same curves. The archive had not been built by one people. It had been inherited, passed from civilization to civilization, like a story whispered at the edge of firelight. But where had it come from first? He climbed the winding stair from the vault and entered the main observatory again, blinking at the afternoon light now pouring through broken shutters. The city was awake. Voices rose from the courtyard. The scent of dates and spiced lamb crept in with the wind. But his world was far away from theirs now. He needed help, but not from scribes or merchants. From someone who still believed the sky held secrets. He thought of her then, Layla. They had not spoken in years. She had studied beside him as a young apprentice, back when the observatory still had funding, still had students. She had been brighter than any of them, sharp-tongued and sharper-minded, with a memory that made other scholars quietly hate her. But she had left, walked away from the observatory's crumbling traditions, and buried herself in the lost sciences of the East Sanskrit star texts, Persian ephemerides, the cyclical geometries of Babylon. Last he heard, she was in Toledo, translating ancient works the church had no name for. He wrote to her that night, not a letter, a map. He drew the archive. Not its full form, just enough to imply, to whisper. He copied the symbol from the base, the triangle of red stars. A single phrase beneath it. The stars remember what men forget. He did not sign it. He did not need to. If she had not forgotten him, she would understand. Then he waited. 2 nights passed. On the third, just after dusk, she appeared in the courtyard. She wore travel clothes, her dark hair bound tightly, eyes sunburnt from weeks on horseback. She said nothing as he opened the gate, just looked at him with quiet intensity, then turned and stepped inside the observatory without invitation. "You found it," she said softly. He nodded. "And it's real." "It's more than real," he whispered. "It listens." She followed him down into the vault. When she saw the archive, she did not gasp or fall to her knees. She simply walked slowly around it, observing, analyzing, her fingers brushing the carved patterns along the walls. After a long while, she turned back to him. "This is older than any language I know," she murmured. "Older than maps. But it's not primitive. It's layered, like a calendar built across dimensions. The outer ring calculates time. The inner ring, I don't know what it does yet. It reacts, Jamal said, to contact, but it doesn't give answers. Only impressions, visions, patterns, like memory. She was quiet for a long time. Finally, she whispered, then it's a conversation, and the stars, they're speaking. Back. Together, they began to work. By candlelight, they copied patterns from the archive, mapping them onto vellum. Comparing the star alignments to known dates, calculating the angles between shifting constellations, days passed unnoticed. They worked in silence mostly, sometimes murmuring a calculation or pointing out a curve they'd seen before in Babylonian stone tablets or Vedic hymns. The archive gave them more each day, not just images, but structure, not just data, but intention. And then, one night, the archive changed. Its light dimmed, its movement slowed, and in the very center of its rotating core, a tiny chamber opened, revealing not a message, but a mirror, not glass, polished obsidian. Jamal looked into it, and what he saw was not his reflection. He saw stars, a sky unfamiliar, a different curvature of the Milky Way, and a planet blue, ringed with a single silver moon. It wasn't Earth. The mirror did not show the past. It showed another memory, one not of this world. Layla saw it too. And for the first time, she stepped back. We're not just looking at ancient knowledge, she said. We're looking at inheritance. Not from humans. Not only. Jamal said nothing. He understood. The archive wasn't just for remembering Earth's sky. It was for remembering all skies. A memory vault passed across civilizations, human or otherwise, left behind, not for dominance, but for continuity. Not a weapon, not a warning, a gift, a seed. And now, it had awakened again. In their hands, in Cordoba, the stars above Andalusia turned on, one by one. Unaware, or perhaps entirely aware, that two astronomers below were reading the memory of the heavens, not as Kaisers, not even as scholars, but as successors. The nights in Cordoba grew longer. Not colder. Andalusia's warmth lingered even after the sun had vanished, but slower, as if time itself had started to stretch, mirroring the work unfolding inside the observatory. Jamal no longer marked days by meals or bells or even the sun. Now there were only moments before the mirror and moments after. Moments when the archive spoke. Moments when it waited. It did not speak with language. It moved. Layla had deciphered it first. There, not just orbits, she murmured one evening, as the mirror flared to life and bathed the room in pale blue. Their instructions, like algorithms, except not for machines, for memory, and we're not supposed to decode them all at once. It's as if we're being allowed access only when we're ready. Jamal ran his fingers through his beard, watching the mirrored core rotate. Or, he said slowly, it's learning from us, deciding what to show, based on how we see. Layla looked at him. Then it's not just remembering, it's responding. The thought changed everything. They had treated the archive as artifact, a vessel, but what if it was more than memory? What if it was intelligence, not consciousness like a man or a god, but a system, an accumulation of minds, layered across millennia, structured into orbit, symmetry, and light. Not alive in the way humans understood, but aware in a way humans hadn't yet imagined. That night, Layla brought out a scroll she had kept hidden in her satchel since Toledo. A partial copy of a Syrian manuscript lost in the fire that destroyed the House of Wisdom. On its parchment were diagrams so complex they were mistaken for art, drawn in a steady hand that belonged to no known scholar. "Have you seen this before?" she asked Jamal. He had in the archives upper dome, carved so faintly into the stone that only candlelight at the right angle could make it appear, were matching curves. "I thought I imagined them," Jamal whispered. "I thought it was erosion." Layla traced her fingers along the scroll. "These aren't just astronomical," she said. "They're harmonic, like sound waves." Jamal stared. "The sky is singing," he murmured. "No," she corrected. "The sky sang, once, long ago, and someone listened. It was more than poetry." She meant it. They began cataloguing every shape. The archive revealed not just stars and their paths, but intervals, ratios, consonant frequencies echoed between orbits Venus and Earth, Mars and Jupiter, Neptune and the distant sun-like point the mirror kept showing them. It was like music, written in light, not meant to be heard, but recognized. And there was a pattern, every seventh day. Though what counted as a day anymore was uncertain, the archive changed. A new chamber opened, a new ring rotated, and each time more of the mirror's surface activated, revealing not just stars, but maps. Not maps of places, but of moments. Moments of discovery. Moments when someone, somewhere, looked up and saw more than stars. They watched a Mayan priest mark the passage of Venus on a temple wall, his fingers stained with the juice of crushed berries and starlight. They saw a Chinese court scholar draw the shape of a comet tail using brush and silence, before hiding it beneath floorboards to protect it. From the emperor's suspicion, they saw a young girl in the mountains of Afghanistan, alone, using polished riverstone to focus sunlight into her first astrolabe, never recorded, never remembered until now. The archive did not favor power. It did not favor conquest or crown. It remembered curiosity, no matter where it came from. Layla stared at the mirror one night, her voice shaking. "It remembers everyone we forgot." But the more they learned, the more Jamal felt the weight of something unspoken and urgency beneath the rhythm. A question. Beneath the memory. Why had the archive gone silent for so long? Why here? Why now? And then came the eclipse. Not a predicted one. Not one recorded on any chart. On a clear morning, without clouds or omens, the sun began to fade. Not vanish, but dim, as if wrapped in gauze. The city noticed. The call to prayer faltered. Merchants looked up and blinked, confused. Old women whispered to themselves and crossed thresholds with salt dot. Jamal and Layla felt it instantly. The archive stirred. They ran to the vault. It was blue, not gold, but violet, deep and unnatural, as if twilight had been folded into the shape of geometry. The central mirror shuddered, not cracked but shifted. For the first time, the reflection was not space. It was Earth Cordoba, dot from above dot. Was night in the image but with no stars. Just darkness. And then, slowly, the darkness peeled back to reveal not cities or lights, but points like fires, each pulsing softly. There were 12.1 in South America, one beneath Himalayan peaks, another glowing from under desert sands in what had once been Mesopotamia, and one in Cordoba. Each pulse shared the same rhythm, a memory beat, not simultaneous, sequential, double quotes Jamal. Layla whispered, "It's a network." He nodded. 12 vaults, 12 archives, or maybe 12 parts of one, and ours is awake. They watched as the lights pulsed again. This time, the rhythm changed. A single beat, long and low, then silence, then, again, a signal, not random, not broadcast. A call, it's waiting for a response, Jamal said. From who? Layla asked. He turned to her slowly. From us that night. They stayed in the observatory, not to study, but to listen. The mirror no longer showed stars. It showed the vault in Mesopotamia, its image flickering as though through layers of sand and time. A stone corridor collapsed, a mosaic of constellations shattered by age, but the lights still pulsed. I think, Layla whispered, they failed to preserve theirs. They failed. Jamal echoed. She pointed to the image. The chambers collapsed. The signals weak, but it's still trying to connect. That means something survived. Jamal felt the hair rise on his arms. What happens if we respond? Maybe nothing, she said. Maybe everything. They looked at the mirror, waiting for a sign. A word, a message. Instead, the archive revealed a final shape, not a map, not a star chart, a spiral, intricate, perfect, infinite. And then, at its center, a single glyph, one they had never seen before. Layla inhaled sharply. I've seen that on a stone in Toledo. No one could read it. Jamal stared at the glyph. It wasn't just language. It was purpose. A question not written in words, but in meaning. Will you continue the memory? Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Together, they reached out, not to touch, to accept. The archive flared to life, and the stars, wherever they were, began to listen again. For the first time since the observatory awakened, the stars fell silent. Not because the archive had closed, or because the mirror dimmed, but because it had spoken and now it was waiting. The spiral with its center glyph remained suspended. In the glass, gently pulsing with light like a held breath, an unblinking eye. The chamber was warm with that violet glow, and yet the air felt thinner, the silence deeper. It was as if every surface, every stone, every hair on Layla's arm was listening for an answer they had not yet dared to form. Jamal stood motionless before it. His heartbeat felt out of place, too loud, too personal. The world behind the archive, world of merchants, minarets, dust, and markets felt impossibly distant now. Even time seemed to pause, a stretch between seconds. Then Layla whispered, "Do you think it's asking us to remember, or to do more?" Jamal didn't answer. Immediately, his gaze drifted to the ceiling where, once the constellations had danced and burned, but tonight, only shadow. As if the archive had turned its eyes inward. To remember is to preserve, he said at last, but to act would mean continuing. What they began, whoever they were. Layla lowered her head, eyes flicking from the spiral to her ink-stained hands. Then it's not just a vault of what was. It's a seed for what could be. The mirror shimmered, just once, then remained still. That was when they saw it on the edge of the glyph. Something had changed. A line, no, a path. As though someone had added a stroke to the spiral, carving direction into design. And with it, the mirror shifted again. Not suddenly, not violently, but purposefully. This time, it showed motion. A vast desert, wind rising in waves across a forgotten landscape, and, from the sand, a structure emerged not visible to the human eye, but revealed through the archive's light. Stone beneath dunes, columns beneath centuries. It was not Cordoba. It was not Earth as they knew it. And yet, do you see that? Layla asked. She pointed. In the dust, carved into the base of a buried arch, was the same glyph, the same spiral, half raised by erosion, but unmistakable. "This isn't a map," Jamal said slowly. "It's an invitation, or a summons." They stared at each other, the implications slowly layering between them. The archive had marked a location, another vault, another chamber, perhaps forgotten, buried, waiting but not dead, awake enough to be seen, silent, perhaps but not abandoned. Jamal stepped back from the mirror. The gears in his mind had begun to turn more rapidly now, less with wonder and more with intent. "If it's been revealed," he said, "it means it's active. Or becoming so." Layla nodded, already unrolling a new scroll, sketching the curvature of the sand dunes, the positioning of stars in the mirror's corner, triangulating, calculating, somewhere in the Sahara. She whispered, "But the stars are slightly off. This is older positioning. The Earth's tilt has changed since this moment was recorded." She paused, "Which means this isn't the present. It's the archive's memory." Jamal's eyes widened. "It's remembering where its sibling once stood." Now the spiral made sense. It wasn't just a symbol of preservation. It was a path through time, winding backward toward the origin of all memory. A thread connecting forgotten minds across forgotten centuries. Layla tapped the spiral gently, with the back of her stylus. "We have to go," she said. Jamal did not laugh, not because it wasn't absurd, it was, but because it was right. They began preparations that very night. No one in the city knew what they carried. No one saw the mirror dim or the spiral retract into silence. And when they passed under the city gates before dawn, dressed not as scholars but as traders with parchment rolls and camel bundles, they left behind only questions. The road south was long, but they had traveled far longer distances inside the archive itself. What was 100 miles when one had stood inside starlight? They followed ancient trade routes, pausing in ruined outposts to study the tilt of shadow, the placement of the moon, the whisper of desert winds against stone. They slept beneath stars and awoke with sand in their teeth. They spoke little. Each of them felt it. The gravity of the journey was pulling them toward something not written, not charted. 10 days in, the desert began to change. Not in color, but in tone. The silence deepened. The wind grew less playful, more deliberate. It felt like walking into a memory not theirs, but the archives. Then they saw it, beneath the sun's full wrath, at the edge of a dune that had no right to be as tall or as smooth as it was. There lay stone, a single step, carved from black basalt, half swallowed by centuries of sand, but too precise, too angular to be natural. They brushed away the grit. Another step, and then another dot. By dusk, they had uncovered a platform octagonal, marked by celestial glyphs matching those in the Cordoba vault. The spiral was there too, but worn, cracked, as if the memory had frayed at its edge. They camped on the platform, too tired to speak, but too changed to sleep. And as the stars rose, the air began to hum, not a sound, a pressure, like a presence noticing them, and beneath them, something stirred. Jamal rose, not rushed, drawn. He pressed his palm to the center of the spiral, and the platform trembled. Only once. The ground split not open, but subtly, along seams that had waited longer than empires. And from the center, light began to rise. Not bright, not blinding, but steady. A shaft opened. A stair descended. The archive had remembered, and it had made room for them. They looked at each other, neither smiling. Layla held out her hand, steady as stone. "Are you ready?" she asked. Jamal nodded. "No," he said, "but let's go anyway." And together they stepped below the desert, into a memory older than dust, into the second archive. The air beneath the desert was still, still in the way a tomb is still, still in the way a memory can be still for centuries, until someone dares to disturb it. The stairwell they descended was narrow, hewn into obsidian black stone, veined with silver veins that glimmered faintly in the darkness like frozen starlight. They did not speak, not from fear, but from reverence. Each step was a descent not just into the earth, but into the unknowable. The archive below was not like Cordoba's. Cordoba had been designed to impress its marble, polished, its corridors orderly, its memory gracious. But here, in the heart of the Sahara, the architecture was different, starker, worn by time and silence in equal measure. No light source flickered, no mechanism clicked. The walls were covered in dust, the way old parchment clings to the hand of a careful reader. And yet, there was something alive within it. The spiral was here to carved into the ceiling above the final step. Layla touched it with her fingertips. The stone was warm. "We're not alone," she whispered. Jamal had already knelt beside. A low platform in the center of the chamber. At first glance, it was a table, but its surface bore concentric circles, thin grooves filled with what looked like fine sand. He breathed on it gently, and the sand shifted. A constellation formed. Then another dot, each one rotating slightly, like gears nested within silence. "These aren't just maps," Jamal said, almost to himself. "They're events, astronomical records, maybe even predictions." Layla stood by his side, her shadow long on the stone. "How old do you think this place is?" He shook his head. "I think we passed the edge of known time a few steps ago." The archive was not a room, but a structure, unfolding gradually as they explored. Small chambers connected by curved corridors, each shaped like a segment of a shell. The spiral again, but now architectural. Some walls bore etched script, no longer Arabic, but older. Proto-Arabic, even pre-Semitic. Not meant to be read, but to be sung. There were no books here, no scrolls. The knowledge had been pressed into the stone itself. They found a chamber that vibrated when they stepped inside. It was empty, no artifacts, no instruments, just a low hum felt more than heard. Closed her eyes and placed her hand on the wall. The vibration grew stronger. "I think this room remembers voices," she said. "It remembers speech, maybe songs or prayers." They sat in silence, listening not with ears, but with bodies. And for a moment there was something else, not a sound exactly, but a pressure on the soul, like a whisper underwater. They left the chamber changed, unable to name how. Farther in, they discovered something impossible. A stone basin, wide as a doorway and shallow as a page, filled, not with water but a kind of liquid silver. A mirror, but not one that reflected their faces. When Layla peered into it, she saw a sky that did not exist. A triple moon, stars she could not name. Constellations that pulsed like heartbeats. She gasped in when Jamal looked. He saw something different. A burning plain, a tower with no windows, a sky choked in violet smoke. The mirror was not reflecting, it was remembering, and each memory belonged to a different archive, a different witness. This was not just a vault of Andalusia's astronomers. It was one node in a global, perhaps interstellar, system of remembrance, a lattice of observation. Layla stood slowly, her breath shaky. This basin, ... It sees what others saw, or what they left behind. Jamal nodded. We've only seen two of them, Cordoba and here. But there could be dozens, hundreds. And in that moment, a dreadful realization settled in the space between their words. If the archives were linked, then Cordoba was not silent. It was waiting, and now they had opened another door. Behind them, the platform stirred. A low, grinding hum echoed down the corridor. Stone shifted. The basin's liquid began to swirl. The spiral reappeared, not in the mirror this time, but in the air above the basin, drawn in light and sound. They stepped back, unsure. Then came the voice. Not a voice in any traditional sense, but one constructed from frequency and memory. A voice that arrived as a feeling of wind in high places, of ink on the first page, of silence before creation. Observation is duty. Memory is anchor. Action is fracture. Jamal and Layla froze. The words were not spoken, yet they echoed inside them, not translated understood, not instructed revealed. Do you know what you risk? The voice asked. Layla stepped forward. We don't seek to change, only to understand. Silence then. A new feeling. Regret. Long-stretching regret. Understanding birth's consequence. The basin flared. The chamber dimmed. A new vision formed on the wall behind them, matched in flame, then cooled to shadow. A city burning. Stars above it, aligned in a pattern they hadn't seen before, one that did not belong to this sky. Jamal stared at the image, his throat dry. Is this the future? Layla shook her head. It's a memory, but not ours. The voice returned. Each archive remembers. Few awaken. Those that do must choose, record, ... or intervene. And just like that, the flame vanished. The chamber fell still. The basin dulled to metal once more. They stood in the dark, barely breathing, and they understood. The archives weren't just for preservation. They were for warning. They had been built to witness, to survive cataclysm after cataclysm, in hopes that one civilization, one time might listen, might act. Jamal sat down on the floor, arms on knees, staring at the silver basin. We thought this was about the past. Layla joined him. It never was. They sat there long into the night. No words, only silence. And in that silence, the stars above the Sahara blinked, unseen. Not out of malice, but perhaps in mourning for what had been lost, or what might be lost again. The sun was just beginning to rise when they emerged, not the harsh brilliance of the desert afternoon, nor the golden hush of evening, but that pale, uncertain hour when night hasn't entirely retreated, when the stars linger just long enough to remind you they were always watching. The sand was cold beneath their feet, the wind quiet and cautious, as though it too had heard the voice beneath the earth. Neither Layla nor Jamal spoke, not out of fear now, nor reverence, but because some understandings are too wide for language, too ancient to be folded into syllables. The archive had given them a glimpse, not a command, but a choice, wrapped in a warning. And as they stood there, in the cradle of the Sahara, it no longer felt like a discovery. It felt like an inheritance. They did not descend the dune immediately. Instead, they stood watching the sky slowly change. The stars vanished one by one, swallowed by the soft veil of dawn. But they weren't the same stars anymore. Not to Layla, not to Jamal. What once had been distant lights now felt like coordinates. Not random points, but markers, indicators, memories, and perhaps buried in their alignment intent. Layla reached into her satchel, pulling free the folded vellum she had brought from Cordoba. She spread it out against a flat slab of sandstone, weighing the edges with stones. It was the same star chart she had obsessed over for months, the same configuration she had traced with trembling fingers in the Archives Observatory, but now she could see what she hadn't before. The pattern was incomplete. Not just missing stars, but missing context. What if, she whispered, her voice rough from silence, this isn't just a map of the sky? Jamal looked over, his eyes still shadowed. Then what is it? A key, she said. Or a question. The silence between them stretched, like the moment between heartbeat and breath. What are we unlocking? He asked. She traced her finger along one of the constellation arcs. It curved unnaturally spiral-like, mirroring the shape engraved in the chamber beneath. But now, outside the vault, under open sky, it felt more than ornamental. It was directional, suggestive. We're not done, she said softly. They returned to the camp without ceremony. The camel driver, half asleep, blinked at their appearance, but said nothing. He had seen the stone door the night before. He knew better than to ask questions. By mid-morning, they were moving again, but not west back to civilization, back to Cordoba but south, toward Mali, toward the whispering edges of the Sahel, toward a place marked only once on a map in Cordoba, and even then only in the margins. Djenne, an ancient trading post turned sanctuary of knowledge, where mud-brick libraries sat like forgotten thrones beneath the endless sky. Layla had only read about it in passing footnotes in Arab manuscripts, references in Berber songs, but she remembered one detail clearly. They had a star tablet, a carved wooden panel handed down through centuries, etched not with Arabic script, but celestial symbols, primitive, abstract, and familiar. It took them 6 days. 6 days of desert wind, scorched skin, and blistered feet. 6 days of silence broken only by quiet conversation at night, where Jamal would read aloud from the oldest scroll he had, and Layla would redraw the basin's vision from memory. They didn't need to plan their course. They were following something older than roads, something that hummed in the air. Not magic, not destiny, geometry, the eighth night. They arrived. Jen was half-forgotten, built of sun-dried mud, its buildings warm even in darkness. The people welcomed them cautiously. Strangers were rare, scholars rarer still. But when Layla showed them her vellum, an elder nodded. I remember this shape, he said, tapping the arc of the spiral with his finger. My grandfather carved it into a door before the rains took it. And when she showed them the drawn memory of the archives basin, the burning city, the triple moons, the unfamiliar constellations, the elder turned pale. We have seen this. He led them through winding alleys to a hidden vault in the heart of the town. There, locked behind wood and reverence, was the tablet. It was not large, barely the size of a small table, but it vibrated with age, and its carvings matched the memory exactly. Not just the spiral, but the sky, the moons, even the tower. It was not a vision, it was history. What is this place? Jamal asked. The elder touched the edge of the tablet. We do not know, we only remember. Layla knelt beside it. Has anyone ever translated it? No, the elder said. The stars do not speak in our tongues, they whisper. She traced the symbols. Some were purely celestial. Others resembled the etchings on the walls of the desert archive. Not language in the traditional sense, but something else. Instructions, timelines, timelines, and one symbol repeated itself. A spiral nested within a spiral. A recursion. What if this isn't just recording? Layla asked, what if each archive is part of a larger signal? Jamal crouched beside her. A message sent across time. She nodded, or a warning, repeating, over and over, hoping someone hears it. The elder watched them silently. Then, after a long moment, he stepped back. There is another. Layla's heart caught. Another archive. He nodded. In the mountains beyond the river, hidden in stone. They left that night, a new direction, a new layered dot, and this time, there was no hesitation. The archives were not isolated. They were one mind, broken across continents, and now they were listening. The river was not marked on any map they owned. It whispered through a valley of broken stone, where green had somehow survived the hunger of the sun. The water ran slow, thick with sediment and story, carving its patient way through rock older than any manuscript. Layla stood at the edge, the hem of her robe dust-caked and damp, her eyes fixed on the mountains that loomed ahead. They didn't look like monuments. They looked like walls, silent, absolute, holding something in no keeping. Something out. Jamal was already collecting wood. The journey had exhausted their guide, who now slept beneath the narrow canopy of an acacia tree, his breath shallow with heat. But Jamal moved with purpose, as though each log he stacked, each fire he lit, pushed them closer to understanding. Neither of them had spoken since the tablet, not because there was nothing to say, but because too much had already been said. By the world itself, by symbols older than LPHABETS, by stars that were still telling their version of history to anyone who cared to look. The mountains were said to be impassable. Locals in Jen had warned them with the same reverent fear they used to speak of jinn or famine. Not cursed, they said, but closed, as if the land itself remembered something mankind had forgotten and preferred to keep it buried. Layla didn't believe in superstition, but she believed in memory, and the earth had a memory sharper than most. At sunrise, they crossed. The path was narrow, clawing up switchbacks carved centuries ago by hands now turned to dust. Birds scattered as they climbed, their shadows darting across rock like forgotten messages. The sky was too close, the air too thin, and still they climbed. Halfway up, Jamal pointed at first. She saw nothing, just shale, lichen, silence. Then it resolved, slowly into shape. A door, not in the architectural sense. There was no frame, no hinges, just a clean vertical line in the stone. A fissure, smooth as glass, perfectly vertical, too perfect to be natural. They pressed their hands against it. It was cold, Jamal whispered. Another archive. But this one was different. There were no inscriptions, no warnings, no spiral. Just stillness, until the wind changed. It came suddenly down the mountain, not up it, and with it, a sound, a single, clear tone, like a bell struck underwater. The stone shifted, not cracked, not crumbled, shifted. The seam widened by less than an inch, but enough. Layla stepped back. The ground felt warmer now, the air thinner still. She looked at Jamal. "Are you ready?" "No," he said. "But we go, anyway." They slid through the crack, one after the other. into darkness so complete it felt like being swallowed. But they were not alone. There was no light yet they could see. A low, ambient glow, colorless and soft, pulsed from the walls, as if the archive was remembering how to wake. The chamber within was taller than any before. It stretched upward in concentric rings, each level etched with lines, thousands of them forming arcs, ellipses, spirals. Not random, not decorative, astronomical. This was not an observatory. It was a recorder. A vault. Layla approached the center, where a single pedestal rose from the floor. Upon it sat a sphere. No engravings, no script, just a smooth black orb, cool to the touch, and heavy with silence. As she laid her fingers on it, the chamber responded. The walls shimmered. The lines rearranged themselves, not erasing, but reorienting, aligning. The entire archive became a device, a lens. She heard the voice again, not words, frequencies, emotion, clarity. It didn't speak to her. It spoke through her, her mind filled with patterns, with collisions of light, with stars falling like rain over forgotten oceans. She saw not one sky, but many, not one world, but layers, not past, not future possibility, and then it focused, a city burning beneath two suns, a voice crying out, repeating a phrase in a language without grammar, over and over until the sound bled into the stars, the spiral, the tower, the basin. Again, then it stopped. She staggered back. Jamal caught her before she fell. What did you see? Everything, she whispered. Or maybe nothing that makes sense yet. He looked up at the vault. They were trying to preserve it. Not knowledge, not data, but time. Layla nodded slowly. Not a museum, a relay. Every archive to a fragment of memory. Each one a witness. And this one, he asked. She looked at the sphere. This one is a warning. They left at dusk. Not because they wanted to, but because the archive had nothing else to show them for now. The door closed behind them without sound. The wind was gone. The stars, however, were not. That night, they camped below the ridge. No fire, no words, just sky. Layla traced new constellations, ones she had never seen in any text, nor marked on any astrolabe. They pulsed in the same pattern as the basin's vision. She remembered them no clearly. Their alignment was intentional. Jamal sat beside her, half asleep. We'll have to go further, where she asked, already knowing the answer. Where the others are buried. Layla looked east. There were rumors of ancient libraries in the Hindu, Kushdot of obsidian mirrors, buried beneath the Andes, of catacombs beneath Venice, where water and light merged into holographic memory. All echoes, all signals, but something connected them, and that something had started to wake. She lay back on the cold stone, letting the earth cradle her. Above. The stars shifted. They weren't constellations anymore. They were instructions. And the time for remembering was almost over. The time for answering had begun. They followed the sky. It had become their only compass. Not the sun or the stars themselves, but the way the heavens pulsed at night, slow, steady, like breath. Patterns emerged with every mile they walked, each constellation a whisper of direction. Each celestial shift a beckoning hand pointing east, then south, then east again. Layla didn't write them down anymore. There was no point. The stars were not maps, they were memories, and those memories were leading them somewhere they had no Name 4. Past cities erased by wind. Past villages that spoke languages older than Islam, older than Rome. Past deserts so dry that even ghosts coughed dust when they wept. Jamal kept his silence now. He had grown thin, but his eyes burned brighter. In his quiet, there was conviction. He no longer questioned the journey, because questions were for people with destinations. They had left that behind. They reached the salt flats at dusk, a stretch of perfect white, glowing blue under the belly of night, as if the stars had fallen and shattered across the land. Layla had read about this place, a nothingness, a vast emptiness where silence screamed louder than thunder. But in that void, something called to them. They crossed it on foot. No horses, no guide, no plan, just motion and light and the echo of everything they had learned. Days passed without sun, nights passed without rest. They no longer counted either, and then, without warning, they arrived. There was no sign, no marker, number, monument, only a ring of standing stones, not tall, not grand, just placed, deliberately, carefully, the kind of care only civilizations long dead could afford to give to the future. At the center of the circle, a disc, flat, black, seamless, like the basin but larger, much larger, 10 feet across, thin as paper, impossible. Layla reached out. Her fingers hovered, trembling. Jamal said nothing. The moment her skin met the surface, everything ended. Not with noise, not with light, but with stillness. A stillness so profound it erased everything: gravity, breath, memory. The world around her didn't disappear, it simply folded in. The sky collapsed into the ground. The past melted into the present. And time broke. She stood on a cliff. Before her stretched a city of silver. Towers like needles, bridges of light. Streets that curved with no center, no edge. Not Andalusia, not Earth. Somewhere else, a voice spoke, but not to her. It spoke through her. We waited. We warned. You remembered. Images flooded her. A chamber beneath the Andes, glowing with crystal pulses. A woman in Mongolia reading the stars as code. A blind man in Cairo carving constellations into ivory. A monk in Scandinavia building a sundial. From bones. Each of them saw the sky differently. Each of them received the same message. Layla saw the arc of Zor, of them rising across the globe like breath from the planet itself. One by one, they blinked awake. Not relics, relays, transmitters of a message older than language. And the message was not prophecy, it was apology. We failed, the voice said. We saw the fracture. We built these to remember. So you might see it too, she asked, without sound. See what? And the world replied, a shadow, not a thing, not a monster, a collapse of time, of meaning, of the framework that allowed light to carry memory from one mind to another. A closing of the window between thought and cosmos, the thing that gave the stars their story. They had lost it once before. A cycle, the spiral was not a warning, it was a clock, ticking toward something that had no name, only recurrence. She felt herself drawn backward, through centuries, through language, through silence. She saw herself as a child, mapping constellations with her grandfather as a student, arguing with professors about alternate chronologies as a woman, holding a stone basin while the stars wept through her, and then forward. A new night. She was older, alone, standing before a group of children under open sky. Teaching. The stars above her had changed. subtly, but enough. The memory had held. The voice returned. Softer now, we do not exist anymore. But if you remember, you as we will. The disc pulsed once, and she was back. Jamal caught her as she fell. She blinked hard. The stones were still. The sky above them burned with cold clarity. It's done, she whispered. Jamal nodded. We're not the last. No, she said. We're the middle. They sat by the disc until morning. They didn't sleep. They didn't need to. The archive wasn't just beneath the surface anymore. It was in them. The sun rose. Not with brilliance, but with a quiet certainty. They packed no journal. They brought no relics, only memory. Layla looked to the sky one. Last time before turning west, the constellations had shifted again. A new alignment, a new beginning, and the last message etched in silence between stars. Those who forget the stars lose the future. Those who listen become it. And so they walked back into the world that had never known them, but would, one day, remember.